Ed Sullivan rushed through the backstage corridors of CBS Studio 50, following the sound of someone hyperventilating in distress. It was February 16, 1964, exactly 1 week after the Beatles' historic first appearance, and the Fab Four were scheduled to perform live in front of 70 million Americans in 30 minutes when Ed discovered 21-year-old Paul McCartney curled up in a storage closet, gasping for breath and trembling uncontrollably. "I can't do this, Mr. Sullivan," Paul whispered through his panic. "Last week was filmed in advance. This is live television. What if I forget the words? What if we mess up in front of everyone? What if we're just a one-week wonder, and tonight proves we're frauds?" Ed realized he was witnessing the hidden cost of unprecedented fame. The moment when the pressure of being the biggest stars in the world nearly broke the most seemingly confident member of the most successful band in history. Before you hear this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover is how Ed Sullivan saved the Beatles from their own success and helped create the most watched live music performance in television history. To understand why Paul McCartney was having such a severe panic attack, you need to understand what had happened to the Beatles in the 7 days between their first Ed Sullivan Show appearance and their second. In 1 week, they had gone from being popular British musicians to becoming the center of a cultural phenomenon that none of them at EASMS, especially not 21-year-old Paul, were emotionally prepared to handle. Their February 9th Sullivan Show debut had been pre-recorded on February 9th, giving the band the security of knowing that any mistakes could be fixed before broadcast. The performance had been watched by an estimated 73 million Americans, roughly 40% of the entire U.S. population, making it one of the most watched television events in history. Overnight, the Beatles had become the biggest entertainment story in America. But with that success had come pressures that none of the young men had anticipated. In the week between appearances, they had been mobbed by fans everywhere they went, followed by reporters asking increasingly invasive questions about their personal lives, and subjected to criticism from adults who saw them as a corrupting influence on American youth. "The boys are different now," Ed had observed to his wife Sylvia, after spending time with the Beatles during the week between shows. "Last week they were excited and nervous, but still seemed to be enjoying the experience. Now they look exhausted, overwhelmed, and frankly scared. I think the reality of what their lives have become is starting to sink in." Paul, in particular, had been struggling with the weight of expectations that had been placed on him as the band's primary spokesman and most media-friendly member. While John Lennon could be dismissive of journalists and Ringo Starr could hide behind his drums, Paul felt responsible for representing the band properly and maintaining their image as likable, wholesome entertainers. The pressure had intensified when Paul learned that their February 16th appearance would be broadcast completely live, with no opportunity to correct mistakes or retake performances. Unlike their first Sullivan Show appearance, which had the safety net of advance recording, tonight's show would capture every moment, including any potential disasters, in real time for 70 million viewers. Live television is different from recorded television. Ed had tried to explain to the band during their brief rehearsal earlier in the day. There's an energy and excitement that comes from knowing anything can happen, but there's also pressure because there's no second chance if something goes wrong. Paul had seemed to handle this information well during the afternoon rehearsal, but as evening approached and the reality of the live broadcast became imminent, the stress had apparently become overwhelming. Ed found Paul in a small storage closet that was typically used for keeping music equipment, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, breathing rapidly and irregularly in a way that clearly indicated a panic attack. "Paul, can you hear me?" Ed asked gently, kneeling down beside the young musician. "You're having a panic attack. It's going to be okay, but I need you to try to control your breathing." Paul looked up at Ed with eyes full of terror and confusion. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't think I can do this. Everyone is going to be watching, waiting for us to prove we're as good as they think we are. But what if we're not? What if last week was just luck?" Ed had dealt with nervous performers throughout his career, but he had rarely encountered someone so completely overwhelmed by the pressure of success. Paul's panic wasn't just about performing mine. It was about the fear of disappointing millions of people who had elevated the Beatles to an almost mythical status in just 1 week. "Paul, listen to me," Ed said. using the calm, authoritative voice that had steadied countless performers over the years. What you're feeling right now is normal. Every great performer I've known has felt this way before important performances. The fear you're experiencing isn't a sign that you can't do this. It's a sign that you care enough to want to do it perfectly. But what if we fail? Paul asked, his breathing still rapid and shallow. What if people realize we're just four guys from Liverpool who got lucky? What if this whole thing falls apart on live television? Ed sat down on the floor beside Paul, abandoning his usual formal posture to meet the young man at his level. Paul, let me tell you something I've learned in 25 years of live television. The audience isn't watching you hoping you'll fail. They're watching because they want you to succeed. They want to be part of something magical, something special. Your job isn't to be perfect, it's to share your music with people who already love it. Ed paused, then shared something more personal. When I first started hosting television, I was terrified before every show. I was convinced that audiences would discover I wasn't as smart or as polished as other hosts. But then I realized that people weren't watching me to judge me. They were watching to be entertained, to forget their troubles for an hour, to feel connected to something bigger than themselves. Paul's breathing began to slow slightly as he listened to Ed's words. Really? You were scared too? Terrified, Ed confirmed. And you know what? I still get nervous before big shows. The difference is that now I understand that nervousness is energy that I can use to make the performance better. The adrenaline you're feeling right now can make your performance more exciting, more alive, if you let it help you instead of fighting against it. Ed stood up and offered Paul his hand. Now, are you going to let fear rob America of the chance to see the Beatles at their best? Or are you going to walk out there and remind everyone why 73 million people watched you last week? Paul took Ed's hand and allowed himself to be helped to his feet. He still looked shaky, but there was a new determination in his expression. What if I forget the lyrics? Paul asked, voicing his most specific fear. Then you improvise, Ed replied with a smile. John and George and Ringo will be there with you. You're not performing alone. You're part of a team. If one of you has a moment of uncertainty, the others will carry you through it. That's what bands do. As they walked back toward the main backstage area, Ed continued to offer encouragement and practical advice. Remember, Paul, the audience wants you to succeed. They're not critics sitting there with clipboards, waiting to catch mistakes. They're fans who have been waiting all week to see you perform. They're on your side. When they reached the area where the other Beatles were preparing for their performance, Ed could see that Paul's panic attack had gone unnoticed by John, George, and Ringo, who were tuning their instruments and engaging in typical pre-show banter. But Ed also noticed that all four young men seemed more tense than they had during their previous appearance. Gentlemen, Ed addressed the entire band. I want to say something to all of you before you go on stage tonight. What you're about to do is make history. This is live television at its finest, real music, performed by real musicians, for real people. Don't worry about being perfect. Just be yourselves and share your music with America. John Lennon looked up from his guitar with his characteristic mixture of skepticism and humor. No pressure then, Mr. Sullivan. Ed laughed, appreciating John's ability to diffuse tension with humor. There's always pressure, John. The trick is using it to make your performance better rather than letting it paralyze you. At 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the Ed Sullivan Show went live to the nation. Ed's introduction of the Beatles was more emotional than usual, as he seemed to understand the historical significance of what was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, returning for their second appearance on our show, the phenomenal Beatles. The Beatles took the stage to screams that were even louder and more sustained than their first appearance. But as they began their first song, Twist and Shout, it became clear that something magical was happening. Despite Mord's, or perhaps because of Mord's, the pressure they had been feeling, their performance was electric with an energy and spontaneity that their pre-recorded appearance had lacked. Paul, in particular, seemed transformed from the terrified young man Ed had found in the storage closet. His vocals were strong and confident, his bass playing was precise, and his stage presence radiated the charm and charisma that would make him one of the most beloved performers in rock history. Ed watched from the wings, amazed by the transformation he was witnessing. The same pressure that had nearly paralyzed Paul 30 minutes earlier was now fueling a performance of incredible intensity and joy. The live television environment, which had seemed so threatening in prospect, was bringing out the best in all four Beatles. The band performed 5 songs during their extended segment, each one better than the last. By the time they reached their final number, Please Please Me, the studio audience was in a state of complete hysteria, and Ed could sense that something unprecedented was happening in living rooms across America. When the Beatles finished their final song, the studio erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. But more significant than the audience reaction was the transformation Ed could see in the band members themselves. They looked exhausted, but exhilarated, as if they had discovered something about their own capabilities that they hadn't known before. As the Beatles left the stage, Paul sought out Ed immediately. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you," Paul said, his voice hoarse from singing but filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me and helped me through that panic. I feel like I just discovered what it really means to perform." Ed shook Paul's hand, feeling a paternal pride in the young man's triumph over his fears. "Paul, what you just did out there wasn't about overcoming panic. It was about using that energy to connect with people in a way that recorded music never could. You didn't just perform tonight, you communicated." The response to the Beatles' live Sullivan Show appearance was immediate and overwhelming. The performance became the most watched live music event in television history up to that point, and critics unanimously praised it as superior to their first pre-recorded appearance. More importantly for Paul, the experience of performing live on such a massive stage with such high stakes gave him confidence that would define the rest of his career. He learned that the pressure of live performance, rather than being something to fear, could be a source of energy and inspiration that made performances more powerful and authentic. "That night on Sullivan taught me something crucial about performing," Paul reflected years later. "I learned that being nervous isn't the opposite of being confident. Nervousness is a form of respect for the audience and for the music. When you're nervous, it means you care enough to want to give everything you have." Ed Sullivan's intervention during Paul's panic attack became one of the most important mentoring moments in rock history, though it remained private for many years. Ed's ability to recognize a young performer in crisis and provide the support needed to transform fear into fuel demonstrated the kind of behind-the-scenes leadership that made him legendary in the entertainment industry. "Ed Sullivan saved my career that night," Paul said in a later interview. "Not by giving us a platform, but by teaching me how to use the pressure of performance to make music better, rather than letting it destroy my confidence. Every time I've performed since then, I've remembered what he told me about the audience wanting us to succeed." The Beatles' second Ed Sullivan Show appearance stands as a testament to the power of live performance and the importance of having mentors who understand both the craft and the psychology of entertainment. Ed's guidance helped transform what could have been a disaster into one of the defining moments of rock history. The story also demonstrates how the biggest moments in entertainment history often hang on small personal interventions that the public never sees. Paul McCartney's panic attack could have derailed the Beatles' American success, but Ed Sullivan's wisdom and compassion turned a moment of crisis into a triumph that changed popular music forever. If this story of overcoming fear and finding confidence moved you, hit that subscribe button and tell us, have you ever had someone help you transform your fears into strength? Sometimes the most important performances happen when we learn to use our nervousness as fuel, rather than letting it become a barrier.